Go live. Okay, so I should be going live across 3 Facebook channels, YouTube and Twitter. And yeah, it looks like people are coming in 31, 35, 40. Right, okay, let's kick off. And for anyone coming into this late, you'll be able to see it saved in this place later. So let's talk about this thing that came out yesterday across the tabloid press, saying Brexit extension for 2 years could cost 378 billion. Let's round it up to 380 billion. Really? No, it's a bit ridiculous. But where does it come from? Okay, so this thing came from the Centre for Brexit Policy, and then it was pushed out to the tabloid press. And so they've been running with this figure, also saying that if the extension was made permanent, that would cost us 4.6 trillion. And by the way, that 380 billion means 11,400 for every household. Or, as the Express said, Brexit delivered on time will give every Briton £5,750, says John Longworth. Right, so there's a new think tank in town called the Centre for Brexit Policy, but it is made up of some rather familiar characters. Owen Paterson, John Longworth, Patrick Minford, Ruth Lee. Recognize these characters. They're all ardent Brexiteers who were doing briefings for Brexit before and economists for free trade before. And they have a brand spanking new think tank with a shiny new document that has just come out with all of these figures. So let's jump straight to the figures and see how we get to this 378 billion from just 2 years. Now, remember, if you add up all of the UK contributions to the EU over the last 40-something years, you won't get to that amount. You'll get to about half of that amount or a third of that amount, in that kind of ballpark. So to think that we would clock up this amount in just 2 years by a 2-year extension is pushing it lightly, to say the least. So the breakdown is contribution to EU budget for 2 years, 22 billion. Okay, so we're currently paying about, 9 billion a year. Let's call it 11 billion. Fine, not quibbling with that. But what else have you got? FTAs for non-EU countries, 132 billion. So by a 2-year extension, we miss out on 132 billion from FTAs from non-EU countries. We'll come back to these. Benefits of better regulation, 176 billion. Controlling of unskilled immigration, 8 billion, and exposure to EU budget cycle, 40 billion. Total amount, 378 billion. Now, if these horrifically become permanent, like the extension becomes permanent, like we actually think that the EU is good to stick around with, either by rejoining the EU or staying in a Switzerland or Norway kind of situation, which we are now, what are the costs then? 367 billion as a contribution to the EU budget. 1.1 trillion in FTAs with other countries, 2.9 trillion from benefits from better regulation, 135 billion from not being able to control low-skilled immigration, and a mere 97 billion from exposure to the EU budget cycles, adding up to 4.6 trillion. Right. So let us go through a couple of those, like the FTA one. Why 132 billion? Well, according to this document itself, in the pages before that table on page 30, on page 27, they break down the costings and they say 3% GDP boost is arbitrarily assumed. So they just made up that doing trade deals with non-EU countries would add 3% GDP boost. Now, the lion's share of any trade deals outside the EU or deals that we're replacing with other countries that we currently have with the EU. The big one, the only really big one, isn't China, ain't going to happen. It's America, the US. And the government's own assessment is that that could put on 0.16% GDP over 15 years. But they say, hey, that and a few other sort of scrawny stragglers around the world that we don't currently have deals with, that will be instantly a 3% GDP boost. So within that 2-year period, we would get the deal, we would sign it, and then the benefits would already start flooding through. I kid you not. Okay, let's go on to benefits of better regulation. For that, they have said better regulation could improve GDP by anywhere between 2% and 8%, just like that. So we'll be cautious and say it would just give us overnight a 4% boost to GDP to have better regulation that would be allowed. Now, where did they get? What are they going to do with this better regulation? Where does it come from? What are the restrictions on us at the moment imposed by the EU that when we release ourselves from those shackles, we'll suddenly be able to boom in better regulation? Remember, this is the $1 million question, or rather, I should say, $176 billion question. Because whenever politicians have been asked about, well, what laws would you change? What laws would you change? Businesses, what laws would you change? And they come up with nothing. Well, this seems to answer it. In fact, actually, I remember in 2018, Michael Gove was prepared for that question, and he pulled out of his pocket a little piece of paper, and the top item on his list was the Clinical Trials Directive. Now, I know something about the Clinical Trials Directive. It ended in 2014. It was replaced by the clinical trials regulation that was led by the Brits, which was had wild praises sung about it by transparency organizations, and it's already come into play. So you can't revise it any more than you can end the Boer War. It's like, what the fuck? Anyway, but these guys have an answer for that. And if you look back to what they cite an Open Europe study from the year 2009. Open Europe was a highly skeptic, Eurosceptic think tank, which has since closed down. But in 2009, they did a study saying that between now and the year 2020, we could save 184 billion in better regulation. And what is the substance of that better regulation? Slashing the Working Time Directive, slashing environmental standards, particularly related to climate change, and basically slashing all of those workers' rights and environmental standards that our government don't want to admit that that's what they would actually do. So the actual feasibility of doing that is unlikely. But nevertheless, this at 176 of 378 is the lion's share of where they think that we're going to just stick on 4% GDP overnight. And then we've got control of unskilled workers and immigration. They think it will be a boost if we keep out people doing the key jobs. And then you've got exposure to new EU budget cycle, where they said, we'll just be exposed to it, so may get sucked into it. Let's not even go there, because we've got the next section to get through as well. One thing that they don't calculate, though, and this is absolutely hilarious, is that if they think FTAs add on so much, like to add in all the countries that we don't have FTAs with, account for 3% boost in GDP, well then, how much will it cost if we don't have a trade deal with the EU, which counts for about half of our trade? And with the EU customs union, we also have deals right around the world. So add some more on there. How much do you take off of that? Nothing. They don't mention it. So if FTAs are so valuable, then the added value of having an EU FTA is nothing, but the added value of having FTAs with countries that we haven't bothered to do one yet with is meant to be an overnight 3% boost. And talking about downsides, what about the cost of suddenly having 50,000 new customs officials, which is what the government has said we're going to have, which is more people than the EU employs as staff, which is more people that we have in the Royal Navy. That's about 40,000. This is 50,000, right? Incidentally, for Brexit, we've also taken on an extra 25,000 civil servants. So, like, is that costed in here? Absolutely not, because, hey, Professor Patrick Minford is a serious economist, guys. Okay, right. Let's get on to the second section, which should be shorter. Don't worry, it's shorter, but it's also entertaining, because Best for Britain had done polling about whether people thought that the Brexit transition period should be extended so that we can focus on coronavirus now, and found about 2/3 of the population said, yeah, that sounds sensible to me. They thought they'd do their own polling. So they asked, and so the thing that got pushed out to all of the tabloid press was that actually Brits don't want an extension. They want to leave now. Okay. So, or as the Express said, majority against Brexit transition extension. Really? Is this true? They asked one question here. They said, some people think because of the coronavirus crisis, we should take an extension on Brexit. Other people think that we should keep to the deadline. And yet other people also think that we should make the deadline shorter. Which of these do you agree with? So I haven't heard anyone saying we should make the deadline shorter. But then by putting in that option, you kind of tug things across, right? Well, anyway, 8% thought that we should shorten the deadline, 35% thought that we should keep it, and the most popular option to extend it was 40%. So what did they do in their reports? They stuck the 35% and the 8% together and said 44% think that we should keep to time or even shorten it. And so that's what wins, and that's what the majority wants. Okay, but it gets better, because at the end of their whole report, they have all the different questions that they were testing out and they were trying out, which includes, do you think an extension is in the UK interests? A net 38% said yes, and a net 28% said no, and they didn't think it was in the UK's interests. So a majority there who had an opinion thought that it was in the UK's interest. There was also the question, would an extension make for a better outcome? 35% said yes, and 26% said no. So there you go. So this, I think, is a report that wasn't a serious academic study. It wasn't peer reviewed. It wasn't designed to be peer reviewed. I mean, all the references go back to briefings for Brexit and Professor Patrick Minford's own studies, or Economists for Free Trade. It's like their own little academia of their own BS and vapors that they've cooked up in a corner. Absolutely not available to anyone's scrutiny. But if they put it in a nice shiny report, they can then hand it to the Daily Mail or the Telegraph or the Express, and then it gets out in those articles, and then those articles can be shared avidly across social media for those that need that manna from heaven to believe that actually an extension would be a bad thing. In which case, then this is a deliberate piece of disinformation put out by this group, very, very much knowingly. So what can you do about it? Fortunately, there is something that you can do about it, and it's this. Just report it to Full Fact. Report the original study to Full Fact. You can find it by just looking up Centre for Brexit Policy. Search on the 380 billion figure or the 378 billion figure and find Sun, Express or Mail articles on it. And you can report those as well to Full Fact or Fact Check NI of Northern Ireland. But still, Facebook, and this is important, Facebook draws from both of these fact checkers in order to black mark some posts and some media stories, such as, for example, that Sun article on it or that Mail article on it, and then it will demote those in terms of the news feed, and it will also start giving black marks to channels that are pushing out stuff that is fake news. So it has the added benefit of really cooling down proven BS circulating on Facebook. So what I would encourage you all to go and do that, to go and report it, and then you've taken sort of like good actions that help keep this kind of malarkey in check. Right, that will do for now. And I will, oh Christ, I've seen the side, there's over 100 comments here that are streaming in. Right, I've not had the ability to read sort of like these comments as they've been coming in. They've been coming in quite fast from Facebook and from Twitter. Yeah. Oh, and from YouTube as well. Good stuff. All right, I will go and have a look at those now, but that's it, me over and out. Take care and catch you next time in broadcast.